become better students of history, what leads us here. And Kelly and I have tried to find every avenue possible to make sure that people understand what it means to be a United States citizen, what it means to live in a representative republic and maintain the freedoms that our founding fathers envisioned for us. And it does not just come automatically. It comes with us exercising the rights that have been protected for us by the individuals for generations. Which is why, at this time, I am going to ask, and please remain standing, anyone who has served in the United States military or continues to serve, please stand up. We would like to recognize you. Civil servant, so please remain standing. Law enforcement locally, fire department, anything that helps people when you drop everything and go to help improve human lives. If you've been a part of that, please stand. We'd like to recognize you. That impressive. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate it. At this time, there are some other individuals I would like to recognize. I'm just humbled by all of the folks that just go out of their way to stand for freedom. I was just handed this. Kim has these. He's from Burns. I spent 4 hours yesterday with Susie Hammond. What a phenomenal lady and family, and really is the impetus why we're here this evening. Also like to recognize, I think they scattered on me like a group of church mice, but Carol, Lisa, Angie Bundy, they're with us this evening. Carol, I'm not sure how many times you've been referred to as a church mouse, but it happened right here in Grant County, okay? Also with the Bundys, Heather and Sarah Reed Buck. Thank you also those Sunday gospel partners. Because she's right there, and she has become an undaunting leader for so many, Shauna Cox. Please stand up. Cowboys ain't girls anymore, I think is what George Strait said. Ken Medenbach. That's Ken. Ken's here. Jeff Banta. Not guilty. Regina Finicum. Please stand and be recognized. I think that's a guy trying to give me smoke signals. About the next couple I'm going to introduce. Is that what he was telling me, Tara? All right. David and Nelda Finicum, Lavoy and Guy Finicum's father and mother. Please stand and be recognized. Fanica. Jody, I was going to save you for the keynote speech at the end, but Jeanette just didn't want that to happen. She wanted you to have your minute right now. Thank you, Jody, for also joining us. We're going to start off this meeting with me and a few direct comments. Everybody in this room knows that there are emotions running high. Everybody also knows that at this time in this country, we have many individuals that have lost what I think is the backbone of our freedom in our country, and that is respect. As the moderator of this evening's activities, I will expect that we will have emotional, very constructive dialogue, and I hope that everybody who has something to say gets the opportunity to express themselves. If, for any reason, shape, or form, this moderator deems that you are not being respectful, your opportunity to speak will be gone. And that applies on either side of the equation, if there are two sides. My point is that we have the opportunity to really take a stand and make something happen, and it only comes from bringing together people that might not always agree, but respectfully at the end of the day saying, we're going to move forward. In 1867, our nation was torn with civil war. Quite frankly, I don't think there's a time since 1867 that the United States of America has had the division that we have right now here today. The thing about 1867 is that there was a group of cowboys, primarily in South Texas. We refer to them as vaqueros, drovers. Those individuals risked their lives crossing rivers, going through homesteader territory, going through Indian country. And those cowboys, in a mere 12-year period of time, brought 6 million head of Texas longhorn cattle from South Texas up what is now known as the Chisholm Trail, ultimately loaded on a railhead, hauled into Illinois, where they were fed on grass, fattened, went to Chicago, and then a guy by the name of Augustus Swift found a way to build a refrigerated rail car and sent that refrigerated protein supply much needed to the East Coast, which was the ravaged areas after the Civil War. It's pretty easy and clear to see that it was the cowboy. By the way, the image of the cowboy was created in that very short 12-year period, and right next to that, Stars and Stripes, is still the image around the world that resonates the United States of America. So you see, it's pretty clear, if we know our history, to learn that it was the cowboy and the intestinal fortitude that reconnected the United States at what was clearly one of the most divisive times in our country. That, in itself, is why I made a trip to Harney County the first week of January. That is why I came back here, because we are being led by the actions and the spirit of one man who knew that it was one man, cowboy, taking a stand that can make all the difference in the world. January 20th, 2017 was an exciting day for a lot of folks in this country, including me. But he, in his inaugural address, Donald Trump, our president, said he's giving it back to we, the people. That leaves it up to we, the people, to stand up and recapture those values and those ideals and those freedoms that the Constitution does not grant to us, that we are given by God, but the Constitution guarantees. And we're going to hear about that through the rest of the night. But what I want to say about this point in time in our nation's history, and hopefully sets the tone for everything that we're going to talk about as we go forward, it still resides upon us as individual citizens to stand up and achieve the freedoms that we know we inherently have. We live in a representative republic it does not bode us well for the future of the United States of America if we as individual citizens do not trust and believe in our government. We need to find a way to turn this new day into bringing together all of the vast and the varied-minded folks, how we go forward and get the trust back so that we can be the United States of America again. And we have the opportunity, thanks to the sacrifices of so many in this room, and that is where we're going to go forward as we continue on this evening. Garrett Smith. I'm going to do better than that, Garrett. I just want you, I know you were wanting to be out there a mile away and make this walk like Miss America or something. In case you don't know, oh, you know what, before I do that, I'm going to talk about an Iowa farmer. Because there was an Iowa farmer who actually spent his entire life taking care of God-given natural resources and converting them into the essentials of life that improve mankind: food, fiber, pharmaceuticals, and fuel. Because that's ultimately what we do, manage God's resources to improve human lives. Well, he perished after a long, fruitful life. He went to the heavens, and he went to St. Peter's gate, and he said, "My name is John Smith." And St. Peter said, "Well, sorry, we don't have John Smith on the gate. We can't let you through the pearly gates into heaven." Well, there has to be a mistake, St. Peter, because you see, I dedicated my entire life, 4 generations, to taking care of God's resources and producing things that man needed to make a better life. Nope, you're not on the list, no farmer today. So St. Peter hits the chute, farmer goes to hell. It wasn't long and farmer ingenuity was taking over. And this farmer was creating, he had duct tape, he had baling wire, he started making things pretty livable in hell, and it got pretty comfortable. Well, God got wind of this, and he said, "Hey, devil, I understand you got a farmer down there. We made a mistake. He was supposed to be in through the pearly gates and into heaven." Devil said, "No, God, you know the story. Once you're in hell, you're always in hell." Well, then God got a little upset uncharacteristically, and he said, "Devil, listen. Either you give me back my farmer that we missed, or I'm going to file a lawsuit against you." The devil just laughed, and he said, "Well, good luck finding an attorney up there." Now are you ready, Garrett Smith? In case you didn't know, Garrett Smith's an attorney. The only feller within 1,000 miles of John Day, Oregon wearing a tie. You didn't need a good joke to learn that he was an attorney. Poor kid. Already generating sympathy for the attorney. Nice job. Come on up here, Garrett. Garrett's a host of Liberty Religious Radio. He brought his wife and 2 kids. Young man, it's all yours. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for that introduction. For any of you that have seen the Robin Williams movie called Hook, I'm not that kind of lawyer, so I did want to start out though with just a little tribute to Lavoy. He really has changed my life. When I think of the Lavoy Finicum, I think of the seal that Benjamin Franklin proposed, the U.S. seal.
Mike in the face.
Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. Thomas Jefferson loved this motto so much that he made it his personal seal. Lavoy embodied that. He stood up to tyrants. And not only that, his actions and his sacrifice have inspired many of us here to be better husbands, fathers, and countrymen. You've come from a long way. A lot of us have come from out of state. That is a big impact that he's made. And not only that, he illustrated that great line from Patrick Henry that says, "Give me liberty or give me death." If we can embody that as well, we will save the freedoms that we have with God's help. I want to talk a little bit about constitutional sheriffs. The events that happened last year could have changed drastically had there been a constitutional sheriff involved. We need them. We need constitutional sheriffs. Many people who advocate against constitutional sheriffs say that there's no such thing because the Constitution doesn't use the word sheriff once. That may be true, but by that same argument, I can say that there is no Federal Reserve and there's no BLM. Even though the word sheriff is not in the Constitution, the reason that is because the sheriff is not a federal officer. And his rights and duties are not listed in a federal document because he is a local representative that's closest to the people and willing to stand between the people they represent and the federal government to stop overreach. That is what we need. Makes me think of those old westerns. I always, when I was young, I'd sit with my grandpa and we'd watch John Wayne movies. Well, the sheriff, that's exactly what they're supposed to do. Fight outlaws. That's what they do in those movies. That role has not changed in all the years that sheriffs have been around. And who would have guessed? Well, let me just say, outlaws by definition act outside of the law. Who would have guessed that our very own federal and state agencies would become those outlaws? We need the sheriffs to step in, to keep them in check, and to establish checks and balances like the founders intended. The sheriff is the chief law enforcement officer, and I'm going to go into why they are. But when you ask someone who the chief law enforcement officer is, you'll get different answers depending on who you ask. If you ask people from my profession, all the experts in the legal industry are trying to destroy the role of the constitutional sheriff. They claim that the Attorney General is the chief law enforcement officer. They say that a district attorney is the chief law enforcement officer. If you ever experience this, you can quickly tell them why those people are not chief law enforcement officers. A law enforcement officer is from the executive branch. And how can someone who spends all their time in the judicial branch also be an executive? That's a violation of separation of powers. So even though the legal dictionary states that the Attorney General is the chief law enforcement officer, that district attorneys are the chief law enforcement officers in their counties, that's simply not true. I saw another post on, one of these Facebook posts when someone asked who the chief law enforcement officer was. And they said, well, it kind of depends on jurisdiction. If you're in the city, then it's the police department. If you're, in the county, it's the sheriff. If you're in the state, it's the ranger. And if, you're in the country, it's the marshal. But that still begs the question, if all these officials are gathered in the same room, who has ultimate authority? It's the one named as the chief law enforcement officer. The role of the sheriff was established all the way back in 500 AD in England. There was a sheriff put in place that served papers, that carried out and executed the law. When the colonies were established, back before the Constitution even, they all had sheriffs that followed common law. Even as recently as 100 years after the founding of the nation. At the time, people still understood the role of the sheriff. Like we have lost that today. But even back then, in 1870, the Wisconsin Supreme Court explained why the sheriff was not mentioned in the Constitution. They said, "Now it is quite true that the Constitution nowhere defines what powers, rights, and duties shall attach or belong to the office of sheriff. But there can be no doubt that the framers of the Constitution had reference to the office with those generally recognized legal duties and functions belonging to it in this country and in the territory when the Constitution was adopted." It doesn't need to be defined. Common law affects every day of our lives. And by common law, the sheriff was the chief law enforcement officer, and even in recent time, if we look at the Prince versus U.S. case, a lot of you may know Sheriff Mack. He was one of the plaintiffs in this case, not wanting to implement the Brady Bill. He said no to the federal government. He stood up. He took a stand on behalf of his citizens. And in that case, the Supreme Court recognized him and Prince as the chief law enforcement officers. Even as recently as last year, July 13, 2016, in an executive order by President Obama that instituted more gun control, for those of you who are familiar with NFA items, it affected how you register those. And even in that executive order, the sheriff is named as the chief law enforcement officer. There's no question here. And yet, we'll continue to see that people will change that. They will try to change that, number one, through education, and number two, through legislation. We don't only need constitutional sheriffs, we need constitutional people to support constitutional sheriffs. There are just over 3,000 counties in the United States. So just over 3,000 sheriffs. That means that there's only one sheriff per 100,000 people in the United States. They can't do it alone. We need to step up, we need to support them, and we need to continue to educate not only ourselves, but our children in constitutional principles of freedom and liberty. What are the duties of the sheriff as the chief law enforcement officer? Well, they preserve the peace. They're officers of the peace, and they preserve that peace in their county. They also protect citizens from federal and state overreach. A lot of people are familiar with the concept of separation of powers, that we have, a legislative body, an executive body, a judiciary, and that they divide powers to establish checks and balances. I went through public school, and I never once heard about division of powers, or maybe dual sovereignty is another way to put it. But this is not a horizontal separation, but a vertical separation. The federal government does not have precedence over state government, which does not have precedence over counties. There's a division, a vertical division, or balance of powers there. And the sheriff has two important duties that they maintain in preserving the county and the peace within the county. One is called nullification, the other is called interposition. And these actually come from two of our founding fathers. The first nullification comes from Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Kentucky Resolutions of 1798. He was the vice president at the time he wrote this. And he wrote it anonymously, so just to not influence, people saying, well, he's the vice president. But in that, and I won't read it all, but you can, go home and read it. It's in resolution number 8. He talks about how we cannot put power in one man or one body of men on earth. And that when there's cases of abuse of delegated powers within the Constitution, the members of the general government being chosen by the people, a change by the people would be the constitutional remedy. But where powers are assumed which have not been delegated, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. The state can do this, the county can do this. There are federal decrees and laws that are made every day that infringe on liberty, that infringe on constitutional principles. Nullify them. That is a remedy that we have through the Constitution. The Virginia Resolution of 1978 was penned by James Madison, the father of the Constitution. He says that there are limited and plain delegations within the Constitution. And anything that goes beyond that is no further valid because they're not enumerated. And when this happens, the states who are parties to the Constitution not only have the right, but they are bound in duty to interpose and stop the progress of evil. Interposition is inserting yourself between the overreacher and the innocent, the people that are trying to stand up and have their rights being taken away, like the Hammonds. We had a good example of Lavoie interposing himself. becoming someone to speak for those who can speak for themselves or who are being silenced by those in power. Those who uphold the Constitution must uphold these principles as well. Nullify overreaching acts and also take action and interpose when the conflict arises. I look across the room. This is a great turnout. Many of us are like-minded. And the reason we come is because we see that there are problems. One of the problems is the federal government's overreach with the land that they own. I was pulling up some statistics. The federal government owns 28% of the United States. 92% of the land that the federal government owns is in the 12 western states. This impacts us every day. They're acting outside of the law, and as such should be treated like outlaws, and constitutional sheriffs can put them in their place and establish those boundaries that were already enumerated within the Constitution. They need our help, but they need to be educated and they need to take those stands as well. What's on the horizon for constitutional sheriffs? They'll be stripped of that title of Chief Law Enforcement Officer unless we're educating correctly and we're fighting against federal and state legislation. Once a law is in place, it's really hard to change. They change the definitions on us. So they sell us on one thing, and once the law's there, then hey, let's just change the definition and continue to do what we do. A great example, I think, of this is in 1913 with the 16th Amendment. They said, well, let's sell this to the people as a soak the rich scheme. So what we're going to do is we're going to say we won't tax income, we won't tax wage income, we're just going to tax interest income. So people that have a lot of money and they invest will tax what they get from their investments. Well, that's how it started. But once you get that foot in the door, look where we are now. A couple examples of how our laws are changing the sheriff's capacity. In Colorado, in Denver, they elected to remove the office of sheriff completely from their county. So there's at least one county I know of that doesn't have a sheriff. If that continues to happen, who then will rise up and be that interposing, nullifying protector of the people? I'm from Utah. Last year they passed a bill, HB 276, and they created something quite interesting. They said, well, the federal government owns so much of Utah, we need to take our lands back. So they created a DLM, a Department of Land Management. Changing the hands of the masters doesn't solve the problem. Taking it back to the state and not putting it to the people continues the problem. And not only did they do that, but in the document where they established the DLM, they said that the DLM, whoever is in charge of the DLM, becomes the Chief Law Enforcement Officer when there's an issue regarding wildlife. Does that sound familiar? I think we could all say grass could be considered wildlife, sagebrush. All of our land, where we live, can be considered wildlife. And they say, oh no, it only applies in certain situations and it's very limited. Don't fall for those tricks. Even when we, we educated and we spent a lot of time fighting that bill, it's still passed. There needs to be more of us. There needs to be, not just a few of us, those that are gathering in this room. We need to take what we learn. We need to spread it and to share it, and that's how we'll preserve the Constitution. It's not by one man alone, but as evidenced by Lavoy Finicum, he can do a lot. But we also need to continue that. So what can we do? When we leave here, we can get educated. We can study founding documents, study the Constitution that has it all in there. It was interesting. I went to law school down in Florida, and I had a constitutional law class that I attended for a year. And to tell you a little bit about my law school, I'll just say they were very liberal. It's hard to say, hard to describe it in just a couple words. But to give an example of how people are being educated when they go to law school, my constitutional law professor's first day, he said, you know, a lot of people ask me, you know, where I stand politically, because I tried to teach in an unbiased way. He said, I believe that President Obama is conservative. I really enjoyed his class. You know, I was the one that raised my hand. I just looked around the room, and we're so indoctrinated every day. And I looked around the room as they're talking about abortion, things that are just so violently opposed to common sense and morality. And I look around the room, and I see my colleagues all nodding their heads. So, you know, maybe 1 out of 90 in that class is opposing what's being indoctrinated to the students. Those aren't very good odds. These are the type of attorneys that come and represent and influence how laws are being made and sit on, you know, as judges on the Supreme Court. We need to change the education. We need a revolution, not a revolution of arms, a revolution of thought, a revolution of morality, a revolution of community and standing up and supporting each other. As we continue to educate others, one thing to keep in mind is that the government doesn't grant rights. Rights come from God. When a right comes from God, it can't be taken away by government. And here we have the opportunity to turn our hearts back to God. As I've gotten to know the Finicums, I can't say how impressed I am with who they are. I never met Lavoy, but I've watched a lot of his videos online, and what a powerful man. And as Tara, the first Finicum I've ever met, she said to me, she said, my father, he wasn't all about, you know, taking the government back by force. He was always teaching, obey God, be a good husband, be a good father. He was teaching people good moral principles. And as Benjamin Franklin said, only immoral people are capable of freedom. As nations become corrupt and vicious, they have more need of masters. To throw off our masters, we need morality again. Thomas Jefferson also said, if a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be. Become educated. Share this message. And what God has given, let no man take away.